Welcome to the Grimfrost Podcast. Today's guest is Neil Price, author and distinguished professor of archaeology at Uppsala University in Sweden. Welcome to our little longhouse.
Thank you.
Yeah, how was your journey? Was it a long trip or?
No, it was fine.
Yeah.
SE performed as it should.
Oh,
which
they
is, unusual, but it was very smooth.
I was going to say that. Did they do as expected, or did they actually do what they should?
Yeah, as they should.
Okay, good. So, how long have you lived in Sweden? I mean,
I think it must be about 32 years, 33, something like that.
That's a while. And you speak perfect Swedish, by the way.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I speak some kind of Swedish.
Yeah,
but,
it's perfect. So, how come you ended up in Sweden? Was it work or was it?
A little bit of both. In the beginning, I first came here in 1990 when the new excavations at Birka, the Viking town in Mälaren, started. And they had a sort of scheme where if you were studying for a doctorate, you could come to Sweden and work on the excavations. So I was very lucky to get this thing to come in. That was the first time I've been to Scandinavia at all. And I guess you've been to Birka, and so will many of the people seeing this. Yeah. It's a beautiful place. And I'd been to places like that as a tourist, but I'd never actually stayed there. And I was on this island for 3 months. And I come from a particularly crappy bit of southwest London. So to put it mildly, Björkö in Mälaren was not like where I come from. And to be in a place like that for months was just magical.
It's beautiful.
It's lovely. But also without romanticizing it, I got a different kind of connection to the Viking Age than I had when I was in my office in Britain.
Yeah.
And obviously I wanted to come back. And at the time, I didn't particularly like Britain very much either, and I did like Sweden. And I was also very lucky that at that time there were lots of field archaeology projects in Sweden. At the time, they were building the new railway to Arlanda Airport.
Oh, yeah.
And they had a shortage of archaeologists. It's a wonderful situation. So it was really easy to get a job. So I just phoned up people I'd met on Birka and said, I need a job. Is there anything going? And so I could move here 2 years later. And then, I haven't looked back. And I met my wife and so on. So I've been here ever since.
So now you're practically a Swede then?
I am officially a Swede. I got citizenship a few years ago.
Oh, great.
So
welcome.
It feels really good. I was very, very happy to get my passport.
All right. So what are the differences from like living in Sweden to England, like working here as an archaeologist as well?
One thing is that the archaeology itself is quite different, and if you, like me, are into the Viking Age, then the opportunities to not only excavate but also see things in museums and monuments in the countryside and the grave fields and things, it's just amazing. It's also a country where I think this is true certainly for Norway, and I think for Denmark as well, where if you like to be alone out in the countryside, out in nature, you can be. And that's very, very hard in Britain. Doesn't matter where you go, 10 other people will have had the same idea, even at the top of a mountain. And obviously, to be close to nature is something that's very important for a lot of Scandinavians. And I think it's true, and I really like that. And just the general values of society and things, I like it a lot.
Oh, yeah. So you moved here, but you said you studied Vikings even back when you were in England.
Yeah, I started my undergraduate degree, my kandidatutbildning, in 85, so very long ago, the Jurassic, and I was very lucky to be able to do a degree that was more or less entirely on Vikings. I had some basic archaeology and things, but it was a very specialized degree. And so that interest for the Vikings has been there right from the beginning. So I could really follow it all the way through. It was great.
So you've been doing this, like researching, teaching, writing on Vikings, on the subject of Vikings for over 35 years then. So what fascinates you so much about the Vikings?
That's a question I get a lot, and I never really know how to answer it. Not just in circumstances like this, but I don't really know how to answer it to myself. I think I've thought hard about it, and I think it's the fact that it's the aspect of the Viking Age that I'm particularly interested in is their view of the world. And people who know me, it's kind of a cliche about me now, as Neil's going on about the Viking mind again, but it's that uniqueness of that, their religion, their spirituality, their attitude to nature, all these things. I find it really fascinating. And that's why I've specialized in things like, long ago I worked on magic and things like that. I'm interested in this, I've called them the invisible population, all these little creatures and beings that the Norse people shared their world with. So that's what really drives my interest. And then that plays out into lots of other aspects of life. So, for example, burials, because they involve ideas about what it means to be dead and what it means to be alive, and where those ideas come from and where people are going and so on. So it's all mixed up.
So how did your interest in Vikings get sparked then? What was the reason why you got into Vikings in the first place?
When I was about 15, it was very fortunate. There were 2 documentary series on British TV about the Vikings. One with Magnus Magnusson, another one with a guy called Michael Wood. And they were absolutely fantastic. It was like the golden age of archaeology TV. And I got so interested in them. At the same time as, separate from that, I was reading the Icelandic sagas because I was that kind of teenager. It's tragic, really. But and it all sort of came together. And my parents were interested in history, so I'd often been to monuments and castles and things when I was a kid, and it all just came together. And it took a while, though, for me to realize that I could actually try and do this as a job. Because for a long while, being an archaeologist felt like something that you see on TV, like wanting to be an astronaut or something like that. And obviously, I can't do that. And then it just, when you're in your late teens and you have to start thinking about what you're going to do with your life, especially back in the 80s. And it just sort of occurred to me that somebody must be an archaeologist and they must have been to school and then they must have done something else. So I started to try and work out what I could do and, if I'd have to go to university and things like that. And that's how it just sort of kept rolling. And then as I said, I did a degree more or less in Vikings, so it just kept going.
That's sort of similar to my journey into like the interest of Vikings, but I didn't become an archaeologist. So, you already touched upon on this a little bit, but one particular field where you studies that is, one of your specialities is Viking religion. And one thing that I thought about was a question that often comes up is was it organized enough to be called a religion?
It's a good question. I think honestly the answer is no. When we think about what we know of Viking religion, if imagine the quote marks, it's from 2 sources. One is the archaeology, which is intriguing and complicated, but also silent. And then you have the written sources, which are much later. And you know how you can go to a bookshop and in whatever language you want, you can buy a book of the Norse myths. Well, they didn't know they had the Norse myths. They had this organic world of stories. And the versions that we have are whatever they ended up with about 1200, and somebody wrote them down, and then they got fossilized. So it's easy for us to look at them and think of a particular story about, I don't know, Odin going to Hel to ask what will happen to his son and things like that, and that's what the story is. But that's not really the case. And I wouldn't be surprised if when you travelled around Scandinavia in the Viking Age, you had different versions of those stories, maybe even with different characters in. And the idea of an organized religion, there was no holy book, there were no books. There don't seem to have been any consistent group of priests or priestesses or people like that. There are people who took care of that kind of thing in your village or the district where you live or at that king's court or whatever. But the idea that there is a kind of an orthodox religion, I don't think works for the Viking Age.
No, and I assume that since it was an oral-based tradition, like different areas would focus on different things that was important to them, and they wouldn't know much about other stuff, I guess.
I think that's true, and perhaps even on a very local basis, you might not know what the people in the next valley were doing and thinking. So I think there's this not only a locality, a localized aspect to all of this. It's also when you look at the runic inscriptions, some of them, and also some of the poems, there's this idea that knowledge itself, including knowledge of spiritual things and religious things, is kind of like a commodity. And some people have it and some people don't. And you think of even Odin, the lengths he goes to know things, especially things that nobody else knows. And a lot of the poems are him telling those things to others, but not everything. And he might tell that to you, but not to you, and so on. And even in sort of the real Viking Age, as opposed to the later textual one, if you think of there's a very famous runestone from Rök, which has the longest inscription, and it's kind of fragments of stories, a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and you need to know what they're talking about. And it's clear that some people did and some people didn't, and that control of knowledge, I think, was a big part of their, for want of a better word, religious world.
Yeah. So how did faith, do we know how faith differed between people then? Because, I mean, obviously there were different classes of people, like the warrior people or farmers or merchants.
That's also a good question. The answer is we don't really know. There's a tendency when we look at, say, the gods, to think that they're gods of something, a god of war or a god of love or whatever. And I think a lot of the Norse divinities were gods of lots of things at the same time. And some of them were gods of the same thing, but in different ways. And I think that might have governed quite a lot who paid attention to who. In other words, if you as a person in the Viking Age, whatever was important for you, you might be interested in a particular aspect of that god and another aspect of a different god, and maybe even more interested in the elves who live behind your house. It's a kind of, think of it as kind of like components of usefulness in a spiritual sense. And if you think about if you're building something and you need tools, and you won't use all the tools in the toolbox, you'll use the tools that you want, that you need to do whatever it is you're doing. And then if you think of that in the sense of religion, what is it that you want? I want to go on a long journey and arrive safely at the other end. So you access bits of that other world, and you might access completely different bits if what you're most concerned about is that your crops are going to be okay, and so on. So I think it's a very personal relationship between humans and everything else. And the gods are kind of at the top of that tree, but there are lots of other things that are just as important. And I've said this before, I think, but I really don't think that most Viking Age people believed they were going to meet Thor every Saturday night. But they're much more concerned with all the other things that shared their world, because they're the things that can really influence how your life is.
So how did they see the gods then? Were they superhuman, or were they flawed, or sometimes even comical, like in the stories?
I think all of those things. A few years ago, there was a project, it's still ongoing, in the States, looking at trying to compile a kind of global database of world religions so you can compare them. And they brought in hundreds and hundreds of experts in different world religious traditions. And there's a list of hundreds of questions that you should answer about the thing that you're specialized in. And I was looking at some of these for Norse religion, And the questions were things I'd never thought about. So, can the gods see in the dark? Can they see through walls? Can they know what you're thinking? And not only had I not really thought about that for the Viking Age, but we don't know. And it's interesting that the one thing I think we really can say is the gods are not omnipotent. They don't know everything. And a lot of the poems are things like Odin asking dead humans for information and advice. And he's one of the highest gods, and he's asking dead people what to do, which is a very odd relationship. And then if you look at the character of the gods as it emerges in the poetry, they're very similar to Greek and Roman gods in a way. They're like a family or two families of rather annoying people. They're also neighbours from hell, and they're having affairs with each other and having shouting matches and breaking things, and generally getting into trouble. So there's something rather human about them, but also at the same time above human concerns. And there's a whole branch of study at the moment asking about morality in the past. Do their moral concepts come anywhere close to ours? Did they have moral concepts? I'm not sure whether that's an entirely interesting question in the end, but there's things like poems devoted to Odin's ability to lie. He's really good at lying, and he boasts about what a good liar is, which is a slightly odd thing to do for us. But I think right there you have another set, probably much older set of values coming through.
So he was a politician then?
Very much so, yes.
So do you have a favorite god?
Odin.
Odin?
Yeah, I find him endlessly fascinating.
Why?
His contradictions. There's so many different facets to him. And he's a god of the mind. This is a rather sort of crass connection, but if you work in a university, you, one way or another, you've invested a large part of your life in thinking. And the stereotype of the Viking Age is sort of barbarian warriors burning things down. And they're one of their highest gods, amongst other things, was a god of the mind and the subtlety of the mind and the sophistication of the mind. And it's really clear that those same warriors, the cliched ones, valued that as well. And I find that really interesting. And all of those qualities are packed together in Odin. And the stories about him, his abilities, he's also connected with magic, which is something I'm interested in. So it all comes together like that.
I always saw him a bit like a philosopher almost.
Yeah, kind of a dodgy one, but yeah.
But like a very human and like normal, but yeah.
Well, there's the poem Halvamal, the sayings of the High One, which is probably several poems sort of put together, but there's bits of it that you find them now. They're sort of an edited version of Viking Guide to Life and things like that. And there are lots of advice, like, if you don't know what you're talking about, shut up. And don't drink too much because you'll lose control of your mind and all these kinds of things. It's very homely advice, and it's so recognizable. So there's that side of the Viking Age and of Odin as well.
Yeah. So the gods were described, as you said, the written down descriptions of them were much later than the actual Viking Age, obviously. So can we really know how they were perceived by during the Viking Age?
I think worryingly, probably not. We have a number of images on metalwork and sometimes on runestones, which we can match pretty closely to some of those later stories. So there's when Thor is fishing for the world serpent and his foot goes through the bottom of the boat, and there's a picture of this with a guy holding a hammer. I mean, let's face it, it's Thor. But as recognizable as those pictures are, we don't know whether that story meant the same thing and was told in the same way when those pictures were made as when it was finally written down. And even earlier, there are pictures of, say, an individual with his hand in the mouth of something that looks like a wolf, which is probably Tyr and Fenris, unless it isn't. Because there's no labels on these things. With one exception, there's a wonderful Thor's hammer. You've probably seen it from Lolland in Denmark, which has runes on it that says this is a hammer. Just so you know, I wish they all had that.
Good object description is always welcome, isn't it? Yeah. Oh well. So now, one thing that was very common in Viking religion, or a prominent feature, is the fact that they believed that the Norns wove their threads. So, I mean, they were fatalists. I guess we can assume that is correct. But how would that impact, things like exploration and warfare? I mean, warfare obviously needs tactics as well. I mean, just because you think your time is measured, you're not going to be a great fighter. But how much would it impact all those things?
This idea of fate is quite hard for us to grasp, I think, because it's so easy to reduce it to nothing matters because it's all preordained. There is a researcher in Denmark called Karen Beck Pedersen who's made a study of the Norns, and she's expressed it really well. She said that this belief in the absolute kind of power of fate doesn't kind of get rid of free will, because the actions that you choose lead you inevitably to where you're supposed to be. So it doesn't let you off the hook for the consequences of your actions. So if you went into battle and think, I won't bother with my armor because, it's all preordained, well, you probably should. And it's also interesting that the Norns are one of the aspects of Norse religion that really are so close to classical deities with the Furies and similar. These three women of destiny and fate. It's very hard to see no connection between those Greco-Roman beings and the Norse ones. But then again, they might all derive from something much older. It's very hard to tell. But this idea of your fate being something that is constructed personally to you is very strong. There's a wonderful poem called Darathaljóð, which is 12 women who are probably Valkyries weaving a textile, but they're weaving it with human intestines. It's really gross. Yeah. And they're dyeing it with blood and so on. But as they weave this literally bloody textile, they are determining the outcome of a battle in a different country. So they're weaving lots of fates in one go. And even the tools they use to do the weaving are actually weapons. Instead of a weaving sword and so on, they're using actual weapons. So you've got a very graphic image of weaving war.
Yeah, the fatalism has always fascinated me, especially when it comes to warfare, because as you say, you imagine the Vikings being these fearless warriors who would throw themselves into battle, but obviously in battle they would use very sophisticated tactics, and if you were out of control and just I'm going to die anyway, it is period you wouldn't be very effective, would you?
No, that's absolutely right. And if you look at poetry surrounding battle, and one of the things about Norse poetry is that because its rhyme schemes and its meters are so complicated, it's very hard to change them, and the poem won't make sense if you do that, which means that even though we have the poems in later documents, the poems themselves are probably quite old. The reason I'm saying all this is that if you look at battle poetry, there's a huge emphasis on being clear-headed and knowing exactly who's behind you and who's in front of you and who's that guy. Bear in mind, this is a time with no uniforms, maybe some flags, but we don't really know. And this idea of keeping your wits about you is very important, and that is the main strategic and tactical aspect of Norse warfare. So as you say, if you've got someone that just goes crazy and runs about, that's going to be rather useless and probably just as dangerous to their own people as everybody else.
Yeah. So going back a little bit to the religion and the gods, in Norse mythology or during the Viking Age, there were basically two families of gods, right? There was the Asa gods and the Vanir, and the Vanir were like the nature gods. What relation did these two families of gods have in the belief system?
That is a really difficult question. I think it's a really important question. I wish more people were working on it, actually. The boring answer is that we don't know. There is this war between the two divine families, which is resolved in complicated ways. And we know the names of some of the gods that belong to each family. Most of them are in the Aesir, but there's Freyr and Freyr and their father and Njörður and so on, who are in the Vanir. There's this idea that maybe the Vanir represent something older, perhaps the religion of the early Iron Age or the Bronze Age. There's lots of rather fanciful things written about Bronze Age religion, and we don't really know. It seems to have something to do with fertility, but fertility deities are a bit of a kind of go-to for historians of religion sometimes, and we don't really know what they're doing. But whether that reflects some kind of actual war between people with different beliefs or a transition is hard to say, but they clearly are different. And then later on, sometimes there are no differences at all between the families of gods. They're just gods. And sometimes it's quite important who is a Vanir and who is an Aesir. And we don't know why. And I think it's quite important. I think there's something important in there, but I don't know what it is. I'd like to see lots more work on that.
Yeah. And you touched upon this because what I wanted to get at as well is like many today have a very romanticized view of Viking Age religion. Yet human sacrifices, like dangerous gods, untrustworthy gods, and so on. What was Viking religion? I mean, it's.
I think it's probably in a sense like most religions. It's a way of moving through the world with as much comfort as possible. It's a way of negotiating with the other, everything else, things more powerful than yourself, to improve your circumstances, to improve your luck. And luck is a very important thing for the Vikings, to help you get along as best you can. And I think this idea of negotiation is very important. It's almost like bribery. You want to be on the good side of things that can do you harm if that occurs to them, and you want to prevent them from doing that. And a good way to do that is to be nice to them and give them things. And I think there is a sort of localized system for doing that might look a bit different in different places, but in the end it is this idea of offering. And you mentioned sacrifice, and there is no good word in English for it really. We know about blot, which is something like that, probably something to do with blood and the killing of animals, very rarely humans. It's a cliche that they're always sort of sacrificing people, and they're really not. But sometimes they do. So it's definitely in there. And this idea of giving up something important. And animals they're not only food, they're your livelihood, they're money, basically. We know that people are offering precious objects, throwing them into water. They're doing this with weapons. There's a lot of weapon sacrifices. In many of the Swedish rivers, for example, there's a lot of weaponry being dredged up, particularly in the 19th century. There's a project ongoing now about a whole weapon sort of find in the Fyris River in Uppsala. So I think giving up something important to you, something valuable, is part of that negotiation. And I think that is kind of the drive of almost like an economic relationship between people and other things, a series of transactions. But also we always think about what do people get out of it? Well, what did everybody else get out of it? What did the gods get out of it? What do they want? What do the elves want? What do giants want? And so on. It's tricky.
So you touched upon it, and I think it's really interesting. So because obviously you want to change your luck, basically, that's what it is. But how would you explain luck in the Viking Age context? Because it's not what we think of today, right?
No, Viking Age people seem to have had a kind of fourfold concept of what it was to be a person. And your luck is actually a being. It's a personified quality. It's not a metaphor. It's not like you might imagine, I feel lucky today or whatever.
I'm going to win the lottery.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's actually a thing. It lives inside you, and sometimes it comes out and walks about. And people with special sight can see other people's luck spirits. It's called a hamminja, this thing. And there are accounts of a battle being about to start, and someone saying, the other guys have got an awful lot of luck spirits. I'm out of here because their luck is stronger. And some of the more famous characters from the Viking Age, like Leif Erikson, the one of the first Europeans to get to North America, was known as Leif the Lucky, and that sounds like rather a ridiculous nickname to us, but it was an important nickname for them. That was a serious thing. He was lucky, and if you find a lucky captain or a lucky person to be around, that's good for you. So improving your luck, how you do that, how do you feed your luck spirit? I don't know, but that was an important thing too.
Yeah. So from religion, the step, well, at least for me, doesn't seem very far to the practice of magic, which is another specialties of yours, as you already mentioned. So what is Viking Age magic? Like how do you, like, in short? Yeah, speak as long as you want.
It's a good question. It's a big question, and part of it revolves around something very boring, which is terminology. Because now when we talk about magic, most people think of Harry Potter and so on. And a few decades ago, it would have been Tolkien instead, and instead of Gryffindor or something, we'd be thinking of Gandalf. And it's the same when you look at magic in the Viking Age and look at the vocabularies of it in the later written sources. It's very hard to translate them because you end up with 40 terms for magic, and I've sometimes used sorcery, which is not a very good word either. I mentioned earlier this idea of tools in a toolkit, and I think magic is the ultimate toolkit. It's a set of techniques. We know at least 4 of them, but there are probably others as well, designed to do very specific things, and you tailor your performance of magic, what magic you use and how, to your objective. And when I was talking about the idea of communicating with the other world, I think magic is the language that they communicate in. And there are special people to do that for you, and people who are trained to do particular kinds of magic. One that seems very common is to try and see the future. And you can imagine in a society which is quite vulnerable to changes in the climate or weather, how your crops are going to be, knowing what's going to happen to your harvest is quite important. And also personal fortune. Should I make that choice? Should I go to Iceland or not? Should I make this sea journey? Is it going to be okay? So there's quite a lot of bits of magic that have to do with seeing the future. And we know the names of certain kinds of people who did these things. And some of them are connected with that, with prophesying. But it's odd. There are special names for people who prophesy falsely, who tell you something that's deliberately wrong.
Okay.
And they must have kind of known this. That's really odd. So there's like, I want to know my future. Yeah, don't talk to her. That's not a very good idea, or him. And it was clearly very complicated, and what we can see is the complexity, but not what's inside it. One of the things that I worked on years and years ago when I was looking at this is that traditionally this kind of magic had been seen as rather positive. It's about healing and seeing the future and helping your cows if they're sick. And I think a lot of it was actually quite aggressive, that there was very much a kind of war magic. And also scaled down magic to make your neighbour's cows ill or wither their hay or whatever it is, and that kind of aggressiveness as one of the functions of magic is something you find all across the circumpolar region, and the word shamanism is overused, and it's also when you start getting into shamanism, it's a game in itself. You never stop really, but if you look at the spirituality of the circumpolar region, is very, very similar to magic or whatever word we use in the Viking Age, and I think it's part of that circumpolar belt of ways of getting in touch with the other.
Yeah. So who were the important people? I mean, you have the Satyrs and the Völva.
The Völar, you've got Völva is singular and Völar is plural, and the Völar seem to be the people who use Sather most.
Oh, okay.
And the name Völva means a person who carries a staff. And when you see them in the sagas, they carry some kind of staff. There's descriptions of them. And this is one of the things we find in the graves. There are well over 50 burials now with iron staffs in them that don't appear to have any obvious function. And a lot of those graves include unusual bits of clothing or other bits and bobs, charms or pieces of animals, occasionally narcotics, all kinds of things that mark those people out as a little bit different. And I think that those burials are probably the real Viking Age equivalent of the people in the sagas that do all this. There's lots of different users of magic. There's over 40 terms for them. And some of them seem to mean something like somebody who knows a thing or two. They're a bit vague. Others are very specific, like the people who prophesy falsely. And it's clear that the Völar are the most important. They're the ones we see over and over again. It's also clear that this is, broadly speaking, very much the realm of women to perform this magic. It's an amazingly powerful quality and very important in Viking Age society.
So how present was it then? Was it present in everyday life?
I think potentially, yes. A lot of the sagas of Icelanders, the family sagas, they're kind of saturated with magic in an everyday sense. It's something that is in everybody's lives to one degree or another. And it might just be that the person who lives 2 farms away is known to do a bit of that. Or it might be something very graphic and very immediate. But I think it was always there. If you think today, I don't want to make an exact comparison, but if you think about every society has doctors, and you kind of hope you don't really have to see one. You don't want to go to the doctor, but they're always there, and somebody is always going to see the doctor.
Yeah.
And it's the same kind of thing, except these doctors might kill your neighbour if you ask them to, or pay them to, that kind of thing. Or they might lead your army, or just fix your illness. So these are kind of multi-purpose doctors. But I think they are there. We also know that the powerful ones moved around. Some of these Völar go on kind of tours, and they go from one farm to another, and they're provided with hospitality and gifts. And at some point in the evening, it's like, okay, now we're going to get down to it. What do you want? And it's usually foretelling the future. There's a very, very vivid description in the saga of Eric the Red of one of these Völar who goes to a farm in Greenland. And the main thing is to ask when a famine is going to stop, because that's important. Everybody's hungry. And then after she's made the big prophecy, just as an aside, it says, and then everybody else came up and asked their questions, whatever they were, whatever is your concern. And so I think you've got that community role in there. And that's why I think that sort of package of magic and its role in everyday life is probably more important than the worship of the gods. I think that is what people really engaged with because it's closer to them.
And perhaps that's also reflected in the mythology itself, because one of the most important and prominent features of the mythology is the Völuspa.
Yeah, it is the prophecy of the Völva. And we talked about Odin having to ask dead humans. It's mostly dead Völur. Whether the fact that they're dead is important, I don't know, but presumably it is, because he could ask living ones, but he doesn't. So that combination of a knowledge you get through doing that and presumably some other knowledge you get from being dead is real power.
So speaking of the dead, funerals. You already mentioned that as well as one of your specialities. So people across the world have always communicated through funerals. What was communicated through through the Viking Age funerals, would you say?
I think there are kind of a stack of different messages that are communicated in funerals. There are two things about the funerals of the Viking Age that are very striking. One is that the monuments that are still there, the burial mounds and so on, there's a fairly limited menu that they chose from of what those things look like. There's maybe a dozen different kinds of burials. And we don't necessarily know what they called each of those things, but they must have had a name for them. And we can talk of boat burials or chamber graves or whatever. They must have been able to say, I want one of those for my granddad. But when you go inside those burials, they're always different. Every burial, more or less, is unique in terms of exactly what objects are in there, where they're placed. Sometimes you can see the sequence in which they're placed, and that's different as well. Then there's animals mixed in with that, sometimes other people as well. And the idea that I and a lot of other people have worked with for a long time is that what we're seeing is the result of kind of dramas, like little performances or plays. So that a Viking funeral was a drama with people acting. And the image I've used before is think of a Shakespeare tragedy like Hamlet or something. And the end of the play, the stage is covered in bodies and things, because all the props. And I think what we excavate as graves are the stages at the end of a play. And they're kind of simple because they're basically a dead person and some stuff. But sometimes the really elaborate ones, they've been doing a lot of things for a long time. And just as if you look at the stage at the end of a Shakespeare play, okay, you've got what that stage looks like, but behind it is 3 hours of drama and all the different characters who are not on the stage at the end. And I think funerals were like that too. And the more important they were, the bigger that performance was.
Yeah. So what do we know about the drama theatrics surrounding this?
I think that there's a guy in Iceland, Terry Gunnell, who thinks that quite a lot of the poems in the Poetic Edda are actually performances. They're almost like play scripts with different parts and even stage directions in some of them. And we know from eyewitness accounts of Viking funerals, particularly the famous one by Ibn Fadlan on the Volga in 922, that there's a lot of people involved. A lot of people are talking and singing and shouting. And at one point he says, I didn't have my interpreter with me, so I don't know what they were saying, which is annoying. And we have to ask, well, what are they saying and shouting? And I think they're telling stories. And we know that stories were so important in the Viking Age. There's a world of stories. Think of like the skalds in the king's halls and so on. They're telling stories. they're not only telling stories about the history, they're telling stories about the person who's paying them. Oh, you're so generous. When you decipher those skaldic poems, a lot of them about you're very generous with gold. You give lots of gold. You've got gold, and gold's nice, and oh, there's gold, but in poetic language, and they live in this world of stories, and I think they kind of die into it as well. And what's going on at funerals, I think, is that they're telling stories and acting out those stories with things, with props, and they're probably stories about that dead person, about their family, about maybe family stories, also about where they are, local stories, maybe political stories, maybe religious stories as well, or mythology. And all of it put together for that person, but at the same time being part of something larger. And when we think of the big kind of the big stories of Norse mythology, Sigurd killing the dragon, or any of those, we tend to forget that there's lots of extras in those stories. You know, the hero rides through a village. Well, presumably people live in the village. We just don't know what their names are. And I think everybody is somewhere in a story like that. And I think everybody, when they die, goes into a story like that. And they monumentalize it. So when you go to a big cemetery with all these things, you're walking through a landscape of stories. And I think they remember what they were as well.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. And I mean, the funerals were messy things too, as you said, like lots of blood and gore and death. What would that like? What role would that fill? I mean, if you're doing a theatrics, like, do you really need to actually make it that vivid? Or
I think it comes back to this idea of sacrifice, of giving up something. The role of violence in Norse society is problematic, but there is a lot of violence, and whenever we find the remains of animals, for example, in burials, well, they've been killed, and in some cases, we find that they've been killed in ways designed to produce lots of blood. There was a spectacle. I think when you see the preserved Viking ships today, especially the ones in Oslo from Gokstad and Oseberg, when they're displayed a bit like Greek sculpture. You know, when you walk through a sculpture gallery and you see all these beautiful Greek sculptures, and they're shining white, and they're very clean and tidy, and they gave rise to this idea of classical beauty, etc. But we know that those Greek sculptures were originally sort of technicolor painted, quite vulgar actually. And it's the same with those ships, because Oseberg, for example, in Norway, there are 15 horses have been killed around that ship, and some of them have been decapitated, others have had their throats cut, and so on. And I'm sorry, this is a bit gross, but the amount of blood involved, I mean, that ship would be red. The ground would be red. Your boots would squelch as you walked. Think of the flies. Think of the smell. And we've distanced ourselves from that when we look at Viking funerals. And it's not impossible that there are different audiences at the time. There are messages being sent to someone who will read this act in a certain way, and other people who don't understand. And also people who will look at the same thing and draw different conclusions. That's, I'll try to explain what I mean by that. With the 15 horses at Oseberg, that's very expensive to do that. And archaeologists get excited by what they call conspicuous consumption. So you look, I can afford to kill 15 horses because I'm so important. But maybe that's just somebody else's vulgarity. Maybe there are people at the Oseberg funeral going, oh, good grief, 15 horses. Who do they think they are? You know, it can work in different ways. But I think those messages are still there in one form or another.
Is there like any magical links to this vulgar display of blood and sacrifice, and like is it like, yeah, if I offer this in my funeral, Odin will accept me, or what do we know about those things?
I don't think so much about the sacrificial aspects of funerals, but there are some actions that you can see that have a very tentative link to things we read about in much later sources. So there are some graves where they've obviously thrown spears into the grave. These are the really big graves, so the big chambers, some of which have people sitting up in the grave. They sit in chairs, the dead. So they've tied them onto the chair. And we see spears have been thrown into the grave. And they've been not just thrown into the grave, they've been thrown over the dead person. So the spear goes over them. And there are a couple of accounts in much later sources that describe throwing a spear over something as a means of dedicating it to Odin. So we don't know whether it really means that in the burial, but it suggests that this is an Odinic funeral, for want of a better word. So there are little things like that. And then if you find someone buried with a Thor's hammer, presumably they had some connection with Thor. There's one grave in Birka, a remarkable woman's burial, where she has an iron headband with 3 Thor's hammers on it that would have hung down over her forehead. It's quite an extraordinary thing. Can we say that she was I'm making these terms up, that she was a priestess of Thor? We don't know, but you kind of wonder, So there are connections to specific gods. And then there are other gods that we know almost nothing about archaeologically. Loki, for example, there are 1 or 2 images that could be him, but he's not really there.
What do you think that is?
You asked me earlier.
Was it very maybe not very popular?
Well, you asked me earlier who my favorite god was, and I said Odin. Number 2 is Loki.
Actually, that's my number 1. So,
yeah. He's also fascinating, and also contradictory, because he's always getting into trouble and causing disturbances, but he's also usually the person that solves the problems that he causes. And then one of the odd things about all of this is that at the Ragnarok, at the end, Loki is very firmly on the other side, when he isn't entirely in most of the stories. So there's a kind of contradiction there. And a bit like, he's kind of like an anti-Odin in a way. He has the same qualities of contradiction, of trickiness, of lying, but also of shape changing and a bit of magic and so on. He's a fascinating character.
I always saw him as a kind of spinning off topic here, but I always saw him as the one god that dared to question things.
That's a good way to think about him.
Yeah. So in my book, that's a good trait in a way. Yeah. Well, so going back now to funerals, you're a professor of archaeology, of course, and can you explain how finds are interpreted into theories, like when it comes to funerals?
That's another good question. There's a lot of smoke and mirrors when archaeologists talk about things like this. This means that, and this is one of those. And there is a tremendous uncertainty involved in all of this. We can identify what objects are normally. There are some types of finds that we really don't know, but most of them we know what they are. What they mean is another matter. So a burial I worked on a few years ago, it's a burial with quite a few people in a boat. And there's a man surrounded by weapons. And that's where you get to one of the first things where we tend to think that the objects close to a person are their things. And maybe they are, maybe they aren't. It's very difficult to read someone's life when they were living from the circumstances of their funeral. It's a cliche, but the dead don't bury themselves, so other people decide that. But what I was thinking about with this guy, there's a sword next to him with spindle whorls, these things used to spin thread, placed on the scabbard in a line. Why? And I have no idea. But clearly it means something. Nobody does that by chance. And that's this uniqueness about these burials. And you asked about interpretation. I tend to distrust it when archaeologists are very clear about what this means. And I like to try and box my interpretations into a sort of vague idea of what it might mean, but not to go too deep into it. Weapons are a good example. Clearly, they are offensive objects. They are what they are. And if you put lots of weapons in a burial, it really is something to do with fighting. It doesn't necessarily mean that this person in the grave was a warrior, but they are being associated with all of that in some way. And there must be a reason why.
Could it be the family want to establish that image of the person?
It could absolutely be, or it could be someone who's died young and never grew to be the person that everybody wanted them to be. I think also that sometimes I talked about archaeologists being kind of too rash in their interpretations. Sometimes we're too careful because we never really know, the identity of the dead in relation to their objects. But quite a lot of the time, if you find, say, a person buried with lots and lots of weapons, well, they probably are a warrior. I mean, it's not a crazy idea to say so. We just can't say for absolutely certain. And the same with lots of other things. But there's also clear that people had different patterns of that behaviour in different places. So archaeologists tend to make rather cliched associations between, say, weapons and men, or lots of jewellery and women, which may be the case sometimes, but also maybe not. And for example, there's a study in Norway that shows that cooking equipment is far more common in men's graves than women's graves, which goes completely against one of the cliches of, who's supposed to have what. But that's just in Norway. What does that mean? And so it's this idea of focusing on individual graves, I think, is really important. Yes, we need to look at the bigger patterns, but what's going on here for this person? Because that's what they thought about. They were burying whoever it was, not sort of, they're not working with Norwegian funeral traditions. They're burying their friend or whatever.
Yeah. All right. So moving on to more contemporary things. You worked a lot with media and entertainment industry within that. As an academic, how is it to communicate research to into this area of popular culture?
I think the first thing that if you do that as an academic, if you go into that world, and I've only done that to a limited degree, it's not my main thing, but you have to be very clear what it is that you're working with. And if a production is an entertainment, well, it's not a documentary, is it? It's not made for a museum. It's made to entertain people. And I don't see the point in complaining that, no, they've got that belt buckle wrong, because that's not what it's about. I'm quite grateful if, the Vikings don't end up looking like Aztecs or something. I mean, that's a plus. I'm personally more interested in the feel of a program or a film or whatever. But that fits my interests. And I think it's very important to sort of ask, what do they want? And also, when if you work as a consultant, you are consulted, maybe. That doesn't mean you're listened to, not always. And it just varies. And I find it stimulating because you think about the Vikings TV series, that it's stopped now that there's the sequel one, or with Vikings Valhalla. But the original Viking series was huge. I mean, it was seen all over the world. And the fact is that more people encounter the Viking Age through something like that than through anything that people like me will produce. And I have no time for academics that sneer at that. Because what they're effectively saying is, how dare you be interested in this? I'll tell you what you'll be interested in. And that is so not the way to go.
It's a little bit of elitism almost.
Yes, it is. Yeah. It is. And that's why I like to engage with things like that, if they want to engage with me, and just talk about for anything else. There's also a kind of idea that anyone like myself is a sort of universal expert, but we're not. I mean, we're any academic is a specialist in particular things. It's like saying, you're the universal expert on the 21st century. And I mean, nobody can be. We all have our interests. So someone says to me, what about these shoes? And I'm like, I don't know. I have to look at the big book of shoes. So things like that. And there was one project that I worked on that I really found particularly stimulating. And it's this movie, The Northman, directed by Robert Eggers a couple of years ago, where there was an intense concern on behalf of the director and his whole team and the cast to not just create things accurately, but to reproduce a view of the world that was not ours in a way that you could feel it, that it wasn't ours. And you always have to remember that with that or any other production like this, well, it's made now. It's not a vision of the past. It's a modern attempt to look at the past. But you can still aim for something unsettlingly different. And in that case, they spend an awful lot of effort and money to try and get it right. The other thing is that academics and sometimes members of the public talk about accuracy. Is this accurate? And you think, well, it depends what you mean. We reconstruct Viking clothing on the basis of a relatively limited sample of fragmentary bits and pieces. And every now and then we find a figure, for example, in metal that has a completely different kind of clothing. And we just think, what is that? Well, presumably they knew what it was. We just haven't seen it before. So the idea of being completely accurate, you think, well, accurate to what? We would never, I don't know. I said this once when I was giving a public lecture. And there were several hundred people in the audience. And I said to them, imagine, it was in Toronto. So I said, imagine you take 20 people in this room, and not only you are what people in Toronto are wearing, you're what people in Canada are wearing, and you're what people in Canada are wearing for 100 years, as opposed to whatever you decide to put on this evening. And archaeologists do that sometimes. So what's accurate about that? And we need to bear that in mind. So that you need to have a kind of, I think you need to chill out about it a bit, really. That's the, and also above all, to think about what they're doing it for. In the end, it's probably business and entertainment, and there's nothing wrong with that.
No.
And I think we should embrace that, which is not to say, if some vision of the Viking Age is just awful and distorted and so on, I'm not going to buy that, but you have to balance it somehow.
I think you're actually very right about this, and I really enjoyed the Vikings TV series. I think mainly because it actually made Vikings more human than almost ever before in any.
I agree. I
culture.
agree completely.
Yeah.
I think it made them human. It took them seriously. They had families. They had domestic lives. They had problems. They had arguments. And actually, most of the first season was set in Scandinavia. Yes, they went raiding and so on, but it was actually more about them rather than necessarily what they did all the time. And so much of popular culture about the Vikings is the Vikings as seen from the perspective of people on the receiving end. And the Vikings they see are not all the Vikings. In fact, they're Vikingar, not people in Scandinavia. And I really liked that aspect of it, that they spent so much time humanizing them.
Yeah.
And I mean, I could say, oh, they got the haircut wrong, or they got, and it's not. It doesn't bother me that much.
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting though, and I hope you get to do some more of that stuff, because obviously you have an impact on the stuff that they make, right?
I hope so.
Yeah.
and not just me. There's lots of other people.
Yeah. So now you have a brand new huge research center, or that's working on a global scale impact of the Viking Age. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's something from the Swedish Research Council that we were very fortunate to get funding for the actual word for it is a bit embarrassing. It's a national centre of excellence. And we called it the world in the Viking Age. If we talk about the Viking world, and I'm as guilty of that as anyone else, but and actually it puts the emphasis on the whole of their world and all of those interactions, including going the other way. It's not just the Scandinavians doing things to people or going places. That was a mutual process. And we're particularly looking at the East and the South, because there's been a traditional focus very much on the West in the Viking Age. And if you look at some key Arab sources on the Scandinavians, they're describing some of them going personally very far east, to what is now Pakistan, India, even to China. And that shouldn't really be a surprise, because things from those places turn up in Scandinavia, and it may be that they've arrived through sort of many hands to get there, but it may also be that the Scandinavians go there themselves. So what this centre is really about is gathering researchers from as many different places as possible, especially researchers from those other regions, and say, well, we talk about the people from here going there. What does it look like from the other direction? And part of the idea of this centre is that we will get a different picture of what is going on, and especially to look at the Scandinavians when they're at a disadvantage and when they're in a minority, which is not the way we normally see them. And I think we're already discovering that the Norse went very, very much further than I think is generally understood. So I hope that this, over the years, we've got 5 years of funding in the first instance. We've got 20 international researchers coming in and 5 postdocs, and so there's a lot of people, and hopefully other people will bring their projects to us. So I hope we're going to end up with quite a different view of the Viking Age.
That's amazing.
I hope it will be. Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to see what comes out of that. It sounds so interesting, and like actually, it's funny because I always thought that I knew the Vikings travel as far as the Caspian Sea, right? So I always figured, like, why would they stop there?
Mm. When you look at, we were actually looking at some maps of places we absolutely know that the Scandinavians got to, and from the farthest east of those dots to, say, the Persian Gulf is a very short distance compared to the distance that they've already travelled. So it wouldn't be surprising. And for example, there's a runestone in Västmanland in Mälaren in Sweden, which records the death of a man who died in what is now Uzbekistan. And that's not only remarkable in itself, it also means that somebody got back to tell his family. And there's also the fact that the runestone is not especially spectacular. It's nice, but it's not amazing. So they're not recording something incredible. It's just, okay, yeah, that's what happened to him. And I think there is probably a hidden world of that. And that just happens to be one that was recorded. But I think there's much, much more.
That's absolutely fascinating. So I'm very, very excited to see what comes out of this. I think it's an amazing part of history in general. So we already said this. You had a really long career studying, researching Vikings and all that stuff. But what would you say throughout your career is your biggest aha moment?
I think maybe the thing about funerals, this puzzle of why are they so different? Why are they so complicated? And it's important to add, I might be wrong, but this idea that we're actually seeing plays. And I'm not alone in that. I mean, other people are sort of coming into that as well. So it was a sort of a one idea amongst others. But I think something like that. And also working with a reenactor called Paul Mortimer, when he had noticed something about this is a bit obscure, but the garnet decorations on a helmet. And it led to a whole series of discussions where we were able to show that there was a very subtle imagery of being one-eyed built into a lot of weaponry and war gear, which is, I think, pretty clearly an association with Odin. And it was one of those things that once you see it, you can't unsee it, but you have to get there first.
Yeah.
And that was quite exciting.
That's a new thing to me. That's amazing. Wow. So I guess I might know the answer to this one, but if you were able to go back in time and be a fly on the wall, or which I guess would be the saying, in like a Viking Age society like Birka or wherever, what would you most like to witness?
I like the way you phrase that, because there are lots of things I'd like to witness. There's nothing I'd like to be present for. Sometimes I've been asked, wouldn't you like to go back in time and meet someone and so on? I'm like, no way. So if I could be a witness and not be present, the funeral of the big boat grave at Uppsala, that is something that I've come back to all through my career, and I'm not alone in that. Lots of archaeologists do, but it's so amazing, and it's so intricate. There are hundreds and hundreds of objects. I just want to know what they were doing. So that's what I'd like to see.
That's a good answer. See, you kind of already answered the last question I have here now, but I still have to say it. Would you like to live back then?
No.
Why not?
Well, I think apart from anything else, that I'd probably already be dead if I lived then, because people didn't live very long, and that's a big thing. I mean, we're talking about a sort of an average lifespan of like 35, 40. So we'd all be gone long ago. I find the Viking Age endlessly fascinating, but that doesn't mean I like it. And I wouldn't like to go back, I think. Right. I'd like to see it.
Yeah.
Send a drone or something. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. It was great to have you here and very fascinating to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming by. And
thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you're watching us on YouTube, hit that bell button.